Hello and welcome to Chapter 5, Musical Texture. Now normally in the world you think of texture probably as some kind of tactile phenomenon, like sandpaper is rough or silk fabric is soft, things like that. Now in the world of sound and the world of music, texture refers to how many layers of musical events are going on at the same time, simultaneously. You can think of this also as the thickness or the denseness of the music that you're hearing. Sometimes music is very transparent almost, but sometimes it's very, very dense with lots of different parts going on. So we're going to start with the simplest musical texture, first of all, monophony. That word is often used when they say monophonic music or monophonic texture. And that is simply a single melody line sung or played on an instrument with no other musical accompaniment. Just one melody, nothing else, no harmony, no chords. The classic example of monophonic music is the old Gregorian chants, which you're going to encounter soon when we study medieval music in Europe. So the chants of the monks in the Roman Catholic monasteries of those days, monophonic texture. They hadn't discovered harmony in Western music at that point. So let's listen to a little bit of Gregorian chant sounds and that monophonic texture. And that was a great demonstration of monophonic music or monophony. Very old music. We can still reproduce it with modern singers like that example today because the music was written down. It was notated. And that music is from probably about the year 1000 or so. That singing has a certain amount of texture to it. It has kind of a rich, deep feel to it. But that's because many voices, they do have a group of singers there. Many voices are singing that music, but they're still all singing the same note at the same time. So that makes it a unison, it makes it monophonic. And from that humble musical beginning evolved the rest of all our music that we enjoy today. Now our next musical texture is a little bit more unusual. We won't be talking about it too much in class, but it's nice to know what this is. Heterophony is the word, heterophony. And as it says here, that's a texture in which two or more voices or instrumental parts elaborate on the same melody simultaneously, often the result of improvisation. And heterophony is often what you hear in old-time Dixieland jazz music, because in that style, the old New Orleans style, they engaged in collective improvisation or group improvisation. So we'll check out some heterophony with a great old tune everybody knows, When the Saints Go Marching In, I think. So in this excerpt, you'll hear the trumpet playing the melody, da 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 da, and you'll hear around that a lot of other instruments filling in and improvising and providing counter melodies. There's a clarinet in there, a trombone, and rhythm instruments. So let's listen to this, When the Saints Go Marching In. So that's really super fun music and very rowdy texture, as you can tell. A lot of stuff going on there. Different instruments intertwining and playing off of each other. So good example of heterophony. Let's move on. Now we already had monophonic music, monophony. Now if that means one musical line at a time, then polyphony. Polyphony would mean two or more melodic lines combined at the same moment in time into a multi-voiced texture. When we say voices in music, that could mean human voices, singing voices, or it could be instrumental voices. So we do use that word for more than just the human voice. Now the monophonic musical example we heard during this presentation was from the medieval period. Polyphony really took off during the Renaissance era. And the example we're going to hear will be featuring singing as well, so that'll be a good contrast between the Gregorian chant that you heard and then this Renaissance polyphonic singing style. So in this excerpt, you'll hear several vocal parts overlapping, sometimes higher parts overlapping against lower sounding pitched parts. And sometimes they achieve that by one group of singers holding out their pitches, holding out a note, and then against that a faster moving melodic line will be sung by some of the other singers. So we'll listen to an example by a real master of Renaissance composition, especially for voices, an Italian fellow who we'll refer to by his last name, Palestrina. So wow, wasn't that beautiful? Man, oh man. Amazingly beautiful music from Palestrina in the Renaissance period. Very well thought out. All that musical activity was planned out by the composer, every detail. It's just all works together so wonderfully. Now let's also listen to an instrumental example of polyphony, and then in this case it's what we call imitative polyphony. So in this example by Bach, we're going to hear a solo violin and a solo oboe, accompanied by other instruments, including a harpsichord. As the piece starts, the oboe, a kind of nasal sounding wind instrument if you're not used to it, starts with a beautiful melody written by Bach, of course. And try and listen to that and try and absorb the sound and shape and contour of that melody. It would be a good idea to perhaps rewind it and play it several times before going on and really get that melody in your mind. And before too long after that, the violin comes in at a higher pitch, but playing very similar melodic material to what the oboe just did, imitating the oboe. And as soon as the violin starts to make that melody statement, the oboe starts to play counterpoint against the violin. And you've got two melodic lines happening at the same time. So bingo, polyphony. And it's, in this case, this piece, it's like a beautiful dance with the violin and the oboe. Very, very pretty. Now, wasn't that beautiful? I could listen to that on and on and on, but we've got to cut it off and move on. A great, great composer, Johann Sebastian Bach, master of the Baroque. You heard often in that piece that one instrument would come in towards the end of the previous instrument's phrases, and they would overlap, and in that way there would be two melodies continuing against each other. Just really beautiful stuff. Next, we're going to move on to another musical texture, homophony. Homophony, one principal melody being heard and played or sung with another layer of music which is more in the role of accompaniment and supportive harmony. It's a solo type situation with softer instruments in the background, homophony. So we're going to listen to an example from the Czech composer Anton Dvorak from his very famous New World Symphony, his Symphony No. 9, the second movement, the slow movement called Going Home. The solo instrument here is the English horn, the slightly larger and deeper sounding relative of the oboe. They're both double reed instruments. And Dvorak actually picked up this melody when he was visiting the United States. He was researching African American spiritual songs, and he borrowed a melody and developed it into this part of his symphony for orchestra. I hope that you noticed that while the English horn was playing that lovely solo, that the other musicians were playing. The strings, the violins, and all those instruments were definitely playing, but they were instructed by the composer to play underneath that solo. And those volume instructions are actually written into the sheet music, if you don't know. So that's where a good example of homophony, the principal solo with supportive sounds below it. Now, another technique that can lead to polyphony is the technique of musical imitation. And a lot of you knew that in the example of what they call a round. And this would take you way back to elementary school probably, where they would divide up the class into 3 sections, and each of the 3 sections would start "Row, row, row your boat," that song, in different places. And you'd end up overlapping each other because of the staggered entrances. And a canon in music is not an instrument of war, but a compositional technique where the different instruments or voices are assigned to come in at different times at staggered entrances, which leads to that same kind of "row, row, row your boat" effect. And here's a little visual example. If we had the class divided up, and I do this in my in-person classroom, I divide up the class, and the first third of the people start singing where the blue letters are, the blue font. When they get to the word "gently," then the second set of people sing where it's green wording and font. And then finally the red group comes in a little bit further down. And by that time, we've got 3 different melodies all happening at the same time. Makes for a thick musical texture. So now we're going to actually hear that effect with not only 3 but 4 voices, all coming in at staggered entrances with the "Row Your Boat" song. And even with a simple child song, you can see how it is easy to build a fairly complex sounding performance.
Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, gently down the stream, merrily life is but a dream, merrily life is but a dream, gently down the stream, gently down the stream, merrily life is but a dream, merrily life is but a dream, merrily life is but a dream, merrily life is but a dream.
So that wraps up our brief introduction to musical textures. We'll be dealing with that more as we go along in the course. Thank you.